First commissioned in 1911, she was the mightiest warship afloat, armed with 10 12-inch guns, 16 5-inch bombardment guns, 21 two 21-inch submerged torpedo tubes, and a variety of small weapons. She was indeed a formidable dreadnought. In 1930, after a distinguished career as a battleship, she was retired and all of her guns were removed. In 1932, she was recommissioned as a target ship for submarines and airplanes. Beginning in the latter part of 1935, a never-increasing number of anti-aircraft weapons were added, and she served as an advanced anti-aircraft gunnery school for the fleet. Is the last official picture of the USS Utah, which was taken in Bremerton in September of 1941. This is how she appeared before her final days at Pearl Harbor.
Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, of which we're a part, I'd like to welcome you all here. This is a very special day for the NIMITZ Museum. As you can see, our Memorial Wall and Victory Wall program, as evidenced by the plaques over here, has been something that's been very popular with veterans organizations and something that has a tremendous impact on the visitors to the museum. As people go through this museum, they are compelled to walk down this path in order to see the entire exhibit that's here. And I must say that there is not much here at the museum that tends to garner as much interest as this wall. As people go by and look at the names, look at the faces, look at the ships, look at the numbers of people lost in the Pacific, it tends to generate a tremendous understanding of just the costs that were involved in bringing victory and peace at the end of World War II. And so we feel that the inclusion of the USS Utah is something very, very special and something we've been looking forward to for some time, despite the fact that Lee Susie's been in my back pocket for 6 months. I must say that this is an event that has been extremely well planned. As you can see, we have done literally hundreds of these kinds of events, and we have had some that have had more people here, but none that have been better planned than this one. And I must compliment you all on the execution of this particular event. I would also like to be sure that those of you who are with us today, perhaps for the first time, take some time to look at the museum while you're here. This is almost a 9-acre facility. It's got 3 floors of exhibits in our main structure here. We have another 3 acres down the street this way that has the history walk where we have all of our life-size relics, our tanks and aircraft and ship parts and things like that, and we invite you all to go down there and take a look at that material as well. We'd also like to remind you that this is really the only museum of the Pacific War in the United States, and as such it tells your story, and so we're anxious that you look at the story and tell us how we're doing, and help us. As a matter of fact, we're always looking for more material for the museum to store for generations in the future. Our exhibits are rotated constantly. We have material from our collection literally all over the country and beyond in exhibits literally around the world. So we never have enough material, particularly material that was at a place or at an event in the Pacific. And so if you have such materials, we'd sure be pleased to consider putting them in our permanent collection and giving them a guaranteed future. Now we'd like to get started with the regular program. Invite Navy Chaplain Fred Welke here to do an invocation for the activities today.
Can't help but observe that this is indeed a very solemn occasion as survivors of the USS Utah, together with their families, stand to honor their shipmates, many of whom didn't survive that initial disaster, many of them who since then have been called on high. Since December 1991, 50th anniversary observances on many occasions have indeed been and are solemn occasions. They bring back memories that we sometimes have tried to suppress. But there are occasions in which, as we observe what has happened and what so many have done for all of us, cannot help but instill a sense of pride, a sense of goodwill, realizing that we are here because they sacrificed their lives, that we might have the privilege, the freedom of assembly, that we might have the continued respect, dignity of human beings, that we might continue to cherish and look forward to the time when hopefully our children, grandchildren, and their survivors might live in peace in a world which too frequently has experienced conflagration in so many and varied forms. The many who have lost their lives have not had the privileges that you and I have had because of the sacrifices that they made. In these moments, then, it is with a feeling of solemnity that we observe together spirit, that we pause even as today is the 50th anniversary of the invasion of Iwo Jima. We pause in prayer. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm doth bind the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep, O hear us when we cry to Thee for those in peril on the sea. We give thanks, Heavenly Father, for these moments together, however solemn they be, as survivors of another disaster, which men gave themselves gladly for the sake of the dignity of life itself. Grant us the continuing awareness that we owe so much to so many. Help us to instill in those who come after us the awareness that the freedoms which so often are taken for granted, whether of worship, of movement, whether of speech or whatever, have been guaranteed only because so many have been willing to give themselves in sacrifice for those freedoms and to preserve that dignity of person. Be with these men and women in these moments as they solemnly remember and observe the occasion which took their own shipmates. Be with us.
On that very important day in 1941, I lost my first aid kit, and on this very important day, I've lost my office. I gave my roll call to somebody. Oh, is this it? It'd probably be the last time ever that the 58 men who remain entombed on the USS Utah, Pearl Harbor, will ever be read. None of us know how many of these men did something that saved our lives, that the reason we're here today. Some of those guys, nobody will ever know what they did, but this is to honor them that we are meeting you here today. So I'm going to read the names and all the people that I told to volunteer out. Okay? All right. There were 58 entombed at Pearl Harbor. William Arbuckle, Franklin Adams, Joseph Barta, Hugh Bergeron, Rudolph Bielka, Virgil Bingham, John Black, John Blackburn, William Brunner, Feliciano Bugarin, George Chestnut, Lloyd Clifford, Joseph Connor, John Crane, David Crossett, Billy Rex Davis, Leroy Dennis, William Dosser, Vernon Elsvig, Melvin Gandre, Kenneth Gift, Charles Norman Gregory, J.R. Green, Harold Harbison, Clifford Hill, Emery Hood, Leroy Jones, William Judes, John Cayley, Eric Kempmeyer, Joseph Carabon, William Kent, George LaRue, John G. Little III, Kenneth Lynch, William Marshall, Rudolph Martinez, Charles Michael, Virgil Migan, Marvin Miller, Donald Norman, Oris Norman, Edwin Odgar, Elmer Parker, Forrest Herbert Perry, James Phillips, Walter Ponder, Frank Reed, Ralph Scott, Henson Schusa, Joseph Sosley, Robert Smith, Gerald Strins, Peter Tomich, and Peter Tomich, a posthumous recipient of the Medal of Honor, remains at entombed in the Utah, and he's unfortunately is very rarely recognized. Elmer Ulrich, Michael Villa, Bernard Wettrick, Glenn Albert White. Did I do?
Peter Tomich, being a Medal of Honor winner off the Utah, and he's entombed in Utah. When we organized the Chiefs Quarters of Texas, which is a branch of the National Chief Petty Officers Association of the United States, we took the honor to name our branch here in Texas after Peter Tomich.
Oh, thank you. That's great. 6 men that died on the Utah but were removed. You know, maybe they were trapped in the turret passageway or something like that. This one man was most of the Utah survivors, a lot of them went to the Argonne for reassignment. And that night while we were standing there, some of us drinking coffee, some of the scout planes from the Enterprise came in for a landing. And you can well imagine that there were a lot of trigger-happy people. And once they were not in communication with each other because there were ships like the Nevada was underwater, but whatever part was sticking out, they had machine guns. The California happened to be across from us, from the Argonne, and so they had their machine guns. When the planes came in, they were shooting at our own planes, and one of the bullets went through the bulkhead, that's the wall, and went through one man's arm, one Utah sailor's arm, and hit the other man in the chest. And that was Pallas Brown, and he's buried ashore. And then we have the bodies of Douglas Deeknoff was recovered, and he's buried ashore. George Smith is buried ashore. David Jackson is buried ashore. And then we had 2 unknown bodies that were recovered, but they were unidentified. So those are almost invariably forgotten. I don't think, this is the first time I've heard their names read, because several of the men from the Utah went to the Detroit. And so those men were at Pearl Harbor when it started, and they were in Tokyo Bay when it ended. And I kind of give them a salute once in a while. But anyway, these are men that died either during World War II or have since departed, and we wish to honor them too. There's Nathan Baird, James Butler, James Calhoun, Ted Swiakala, W.G. Lieber, Elmer McKeever, James Mills, Robert Moore, Victor Nieranen, William Spindon, Glenn Trotter, James Younger, Christopher Zett, Neil Gunderland, Raymond Kelly, and John Wallace. Now, I really had plans for somebody to ring these bells, and Elmer McKeever, we haven't used rank, you notice, but Elmer achieved flag rank. He became a captain and commanded his own ship, and his widow, Mrs. McKeever, came all the way from Virginia, Washington, D.C., and she brought her daughter, an active naval officer commander, Michelle McCader. So they, and of course, I'm not going to leave my family out. My daughter, one daughter flew from, where do you live? From Riverside, California, and then my other daughter from Amarillo, Texas. And I had a son, I didn't know this until I saw him yesterday, who's been in Costa Rica and Mexico. He's got a girlfriend in Mexico City. And I'd already been told he's not going to make it. So yesterday when I'm hugging my daughter there, he showed up. So I'm really honored that they took so much time to come here. Now, I told somebody I was going to speak 2 minutes. Have I talked a minute yet? What? That's my daughter. Oh, and my wife, Peggy, and she was, I was a chief petty officer. We were married in Honolulu. I was a chief petty officer, and she was a lieutenant junior grade. But I've always run the house. I do whatever she says. Thank you.
All right, our plaque says USS Utah, BB31/AG16. In memory of our 58 shipmates entombed in the USS Utah at Pearl Harbor, created, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. To honor also the USS Utah former sailors and Marines who continued to fight for our country during World War II and after, and in remembrance of shipmates who have since passed away. We shall never forget. Read the last part of it.
Presented by friends, relatives, and former shipmates who remain united by the bonds of comradeship. Lord, grant us fair winds the following sea.
Half right. Hey. Ready. Hey. Fire.
Salute.
Hey. Fire. Hey. Fire. Half left. Hey. Present. Fire.
And I think it is for us, the living, now to reaffirm our commitment to God and country. And to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, I'd like to ask Al Block, he's the chairman of the Texas Pearl Harbor Survivors, to come over. And Al Fickle, he's the director of the 4th District of the Pearl Harbor Survivors. And Bill Eckel, he's the National Pearl Harbor Survivors Treasurer. And they will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now Al Block, the chairman of the Texas Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, has a few words.
I just want to give a special thanks to those members of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, their spouses, their families, who are not members of the Utah, but were at Pearl Harbor. Thank them for coming here and supporting the USS Utah. The USS Utah has, those of you who read that article in the American Legion magazine, has in the past been slighted many times. And the next time I go to Pearl Harbor on any occasion, I'm going to make a special effort to go to the memorial there on Ford Island to the USS Utah. Thank you again.
Almighty God, we make our earnest prayer that thou wilt keep the United States in thy holy protection, that thou wilt incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, and entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another and for their fellow citizens of the United States at large. And finally, that thou wilt most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without an humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation. Grant our supplications, we beseech thee, through Jesus Christ our Lord.
We'd like to recognize Lee Sousey and his wife Mickey, beg your pardon, wife Peggy, because without them this would have never happened, and I think we owe them that much.
Aboard Utah in June of '41 in Bremerton, Washington. We took it over to Pearl Harbor, and I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was, but I knew the fleet was there. I was so surprised to hear that it was in Honolulu, in Hawaii. I had no idea, but I knew anyway. So I was getting ready for Liberty that morning, and about 7:50 something, and then we heard the first bang, and so somebody made a remark about the Japs hit us, you know. Well, what they did, you know. So when the ship started rolling, I went up on top side, tried to get on top side, and the bugler blew us down below because it was too dangerous for us to get off the ship at that time for all the timbers that were on it. So I went back down below, and my division, 3 decks below, in 3rd Division, and I turned off our prize and jute box, you know, and it was still going around. And there was lights down below. The ship was on practically 45 degree, and there were still lights. That's the people that saved that had the lights on. That's were the ones that got got killed there. Anyway, so I turned the jute box off and went around, had to swim around the other side to get up there. And the ship was on its side there when I got off, and I was sitting on the blister, and of the ship on the side of the ship, we had these blisters, you know, protected. Anyway, they were yelling at me to jump off, you know, and I said, I knew that the ship, I'm French descent, I'm frog, but this frog couldn't jump 17 feet. So, I slid. Finally, they were bombing, getting so close to me that finally I had to go off on my back and scrape my back and barnacles and whatnot. And finally, I'm not a swimmer. How I ever got in the Navy, I'll never know. I cheated there too. But anyway, so I get on this cable that was across on a day, and I hugged that thing until I exhausted. I fell in about 2 feet of mud. So I went in the trench with the rest of the guys. So while I was in there, this other young fellow and I, boot camp, you know, out of boot camp, we decided there was two planes on Ford Island. They didn't have a propeller, but they had a 30 caliber machine gun hanging over the side. So we thought we'd scare these Japs off, you know. So I jumped on the first torpedo. I took mine, he said, you took the other one. I put one foot on the wing, and I started to put my foot in the cockpit, and they saw the plane in half on me. Oh. So we ran back to the trench and behaved.
That scared
We knew the war was on.
Right. I was a seaman first class aboard the USS Utah that morning, and I had a cleaning station up in the officers' country which is up in towards the bow part of the ship. And my buddy and I were up on the top side with our swabs over the side, wrenching them out and getting ready to clean up the place we were supposed to clean up. And we saw the planes coming in, and we thought they were the planes from the USS Enterprise, which they usually fly those planes in when they're coming in. We was moored where they're supposed to be berthed, so we were going to have to move that morning early. So I told him we needed to get down and get it cleaned up and get ready to move. And so we went down and started swabbing the deck in the officers' country, and when the first torpedo hit, and then it just was bedlam after that. I made my way topside, and by that time the ship was capsizing, and they announced bad the ship, so I went over the side and swam over to Ford Island.
Well, I happened to be looking out the porthole before any bombs or torpedoes were dropped, and seeing those planes come down and drop those bombs, I have that picture firmly embedded in my mind. The most vivid memory is my enlistment was up December 7th, 1941. Oh. Yeah. And then I was a pharmacist, mate, and I had gotten my Red Cross brassard, which is what a good pharmacist mate or medical corpsman's supposed to do. And so I wore that all that day, and I've just donated it to the museum here. Uh-huh. So, but, you know, we saw many very badly burned patients and injuries of all sorts and without equipment. And I'll tell you one thing and then I'll shut up. We ran out of alcohol and iodine and everything, and so this officer came by and said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "We don't have anything. These guys are covered with oil, you know, and wounds, and a cut or a bullet wound with oil, you know, is a bad thing." I said, "We need some alcohol real bad." So he said, "Well, alcohol," he said, "would whiskey do?" And before we could confer, he took off, came back with a case of scotch, and that's what we were using for cleaning the wounds.
Well, I'll give you a short sum of the time we was hit till I got ashore. I was 3 decks down, below decks, when the first torpedo hit. Well, there's probably a dozen of us in the compartment, and by the time that we got to top side, she was already listing pretty heavy. We had to go up the ladder sideways. Went over the side, and someone jumped above me and knocked me loose from this hawser I was going down on. And when it did, I slid on my back on those barnacles there and went down between the ship and Fox 11. And I was drowning. I couldn't get out, and I'd grab a hold of the post and I'd slide in. So I was hollering for help. Well, a man stopped and reached down and pulled me out of the water up onto the Fox 11. And just about the time he did, the ship rolled in and just disintegrated Fox 11 and threw us over the other side back into the water. Well, then a motor launch come along and picked me up. Got in the motor launch, and on the way to the beach, the coxswain of the boat hung the tiller on a low water crossing cable. Well, when that boat stopped, I couldn't wait. I dove out of the motor launch and swam the rest of the way to shore. And they were putting in a new pipeline on Fort Island, and it was just a natural trench. It was about 2 or 3 foot wide and about 6 foot deep. So we used that as a trench, and I guess that's probably saved a lot of our lives by being able to get in there. And a little bit of corpsman coming along, he got to me and he said, "How bad are you hurt?" I said, "I'm not hurt." Excuse me. He said, "Pull off that skivvy shirt." Well, when he did, what had happened, the barnacles, when I slid on my back, it ripped my back pretty bad. And that shirt was just as red as, you know, blood. That's all of it. So the ones of us that were wounded, they put us in a carry-all and went right out across Fort Island. This was during the bombing strafing to the dispensary there on Fort Island. And
well, I guess the most vivid memory is whenever the first torpedo hit, I was sitting on the commode. And there was some guy, tugs used to hit us once in a while, and some guy hollered, said, "Watch where you going out there, you SB?" And I said, "Well, that's not a tug." And I got up, looked out the porthole and saw those planes coming in. And then I started to go down to where I the bunks at and tell everybody we've been attacked by the Japs, and I got about halfway down the ship and was up knee-deep in water, so I started trying to get off. And I finally made it off. I think I was the last one to get off the ship, other than one other guy that fell over on the other side as it rolled over.
That torpedo hit, and I was at the mess table, and I was reading my comics, so I folded those up, and about that time the water was coming in. I had to get out, so I jumped in the water and got over on Fort Island. That's about it.
Okay.
And I walked sentry duty the rest of the day.
You excuse me?
Sentry duty.
Ah, okay.
They was expecting paratroops.